How we got here is returning to its roots, geographical and historical. We'll be strapping ourselves into our time machine and taking you round our Eastern European region. Our first, but not probably our last stop, is Belarus, a country between East and West, right on Europe's geographic and historical fault line. So, what has its journey been like? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Belarusians and part of their current lands used to be part of 18th century Europe's most progressive state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Its absolutist neighbours, Prussia, Austria and Russia, would not allow the state, which had recently adopted Europe's first modern constitution, to exist. As the three monarchies divided the Commonwealth's territory, Belarusians were swept away into the Russian sphere of influence. Belarusian territories were divided into several governorates within the Russian administrative system. Russification policies intensified, especially after the failed Polish uprisings of 1830 to 1831 and 1863 to 1864. Speaking Polish or Belarusian was penalized and Latin and Belarusian scripts banned. However, during this time the Belarusian national revival gained momentum, with intellectuals structuring the Belarusian language and insurgents fighting for national independence during the January uprising. While the intellectual effort proved effective in the long run, the armed struggle was crushed by the Russian occupier. During World War I, Belarus became a major battleground between Germany and Russia, suffering severe destruction. The Russian February Revolution of 1917 led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, and the Bolshevik Revolution further destabilized the region. In response to German occupation, Belarusian nationalists declared the short-lived Belarusian People's Republic on March 25, 1918, with its capital in Minsk. However, this republic lacked real power and relied on German support. When Germany was defeated in November 1918, the Belarusian People's Republic collapsed as Soviet forces advanced. Once the fires of World War I died out, Belarusians found themselves among Central Eastern European nations striving for their very own independent states. Poles, the Baltic nations, and momentarily Ukrainians were successful in this regard. But Belarusians were not, finding the territory they laid claims to divided between the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Soviet Republic within the USSR, established in 1919, and Poland, which incorporated Western Belarus as a result of the Polish-Soviet War. The move was formalized by the Treaty of Riga in 1921. When the Soviet Union invaded Poland on September 17, 1939, it snatched Western Belarus under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and incorporated it into the Soviet Belarusia. Belarusian lands found themselves reunified, albeit under a destructive sovereign that cared little for Belarusian national identity and its tattered, albeit clearly Western heritage.
Our guest today is Aleś Łahviniec. He's a political scientist at the Free University of Belarus. Welcome to the programme.
Hello.
We saw a kind of potted history of Belarus. Belarus, not Belarusia, of course. But can you, before we delve into the history, 18th century history of the country, can you give us a reason why it is Belarus and not Belarusia? What's the phonetic mistake that we make in the West about that?
Because Russian is not Belarusian or Ruthenian. It refers Ruthenian or Belarusian. It refers to the Kievan Ruthenia Rus. The right adjective is Belarusian.
Does this lay in people's minds, certainly in the West, that this is Belarusia, Ruthenia, Rus, the old territory of the nation, that has always been somehow Russian? Is this the mistake that we make in the West?
I think it was at least a mistake made in the West. Now I think it has changed. There is a number of books of studies of Belarus, and there is a clear understanding that Belarusian doesn't mean Russian or just White Russian or whatsoever, because there was also confusion because some people in the West confused the whites, well, during the Russian Civil War with the white Belarusians and so on. So it's very complicated. So Belarusian.
If we go into our time machine and go back to the area in the sort of late 18th century, the time of the partitions of Poland, Lithuania, Rus was a region of formerly under the tutelage of Lithuania. What was the reaction of the Ruthenian, the peasantry, the Ruthenian nobility to the partitions of the 18th century of Poland, Lithuania?
First, just Rus was split after the creation of Rzecz Pospolita in 17th century. So the southern part of Rus, today's Ukraine, belonged to the crown, directly to Poland, to Warsaw, well, Krakow, Warsaw, yes. And the northern part, well, of Ruthenia, nowadays Belarus, belonged to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So, well, there were no agency, let's say, of difference belonging to this Respublika. Surely there were differences because Belarusians, for example, like Ukrainians, were mostly uniats by the end of 18th century, and it was a kind of national church for us because up to 70%. During the partitions, up to 70% of Belarusians were uniats, union church that meant that, well, recognized
to Moscow,
recognized
to Rome,
the authority of
yes.
the Pope, but using the, let's say, rather orthodox rituals. And this was a difference. Of course, the difference from the, let's say, mainland Poland was that there were also Orthodox, and they were instrumentalized especially by the Russian Empire, by Catherine II, and there were all surely Catholics and Jews. So, well, I wouldn't claim that Belarusians, in our today's understanding, at the end of 18th century had any agency. Let's say it was not so different. The occupying powers that participated in these partitions, they used the weaknesses of this Poland, and they tried to instrumentalize either so-called dissidents or also peasantry, but to a lesser degree. Well, the main drivers, let's say, of all these events were nobility.
Yes. We talked about the Belarusian culture, whether it was a peasant culture or was a Polonized culture, and you mentioned this idea of a nation starts to become a nation once it gets a high culture, a professional class, a language, a grammar. In the 18th century, was this a process that was happening, or was Rus mainly a peasant nation with a Polonized aristocracy? Is that the way we should see it?
Rather the latter. I mean, yeah. Well, culturally, the ruling class was considered themselves as part of the Polish nation. It could be Genta Lithuania. They could have some Lithuanian, let's say, identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, but mostly when we talk about nation is a modern concept, so it comes with modernity. And there were no nation states in medieval ages or early modern history. So when we use this term referring to 18th century, it's not entirely appropriate. But when we look at how the national movement, nation building, did happen across Belarus or in Eastern Europe, well, the language was important. The language was one of the defining features of national identity. Well, so at that time in the 18th century, there were no, let's say, the Belarusian language was not used by the elites, There were no literal language. There were some pieces of Belarusian language in Latin letters used in some books or works in Polish. And the Belarusian language was not used in the public administration as well. So, it was mainly peasants' culture, and the interest to it was born with Romanticism in early 19th century.
And the experiment of having a federated state, Poland-Lithuania, had failed, and this was a response to it. The different nationalities, Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Lithuanian, fragmented and found their own identity. So is Belarusian identity a product of the 19th century, this national movement? How would you...
Yes and no, because there are prerequisites, like more, profounder, deeper tradition, let's say, traditions and language and material culture, and it to some extent pre-existed. But if we consider nations as modern constructs, so yes, the Belarusian nation, the national movement, idea of Belarusian nation was mostly born in 19th century and accelerated while the idea was strengthened at the beginning of 20th century. Because we were exactly maybe the last to renounce to the federalist ideas, because the political class, the nobility, fought for the restoration of Poland. Twice there were two uprisings, and Belarusians were also participating in that.
Which we tend to forget.
Yeah, such figures as Emilia Plater. She operated on the territory of nowadays Belarus, and she was supported. So it is also a hero for us. So we have, especially from the 19th century, we have common, historic figures that are common to both to Poles and to Belarusians. That's great that Poles now are strong enough to recognize that they can share.
Yes.
This. It's not the case of Lithuanians to some extent.
Not everything is Polish, I suppose. Yeah. Let's see our second clip, our second report, that brings us into the 20th and the 21st centuries.
In June 1941, Nazi Germany turned against its former ally, the Soviet Union. As part of Operation Barbarossa, German forces occupied Belarus, bringing immense destruction to the region. Over a quarter of its population perished, including almost all of its Jewish community in the Holocaust. In mid-1944, the Red Army recaptured Belarus and re-established it as a Soviet republic. Interestingly, the USSR sought to emphasize its Belarusian addition's normal sovereignty by allowing it to feature as one of the founding members of the United Nations in 1945. As the Cold War continued, one event served as a harbinger of the Soviet Union's fall, the Chernobyl disaster. The reactor had inherited design flaws, much like the Soviet planned economy, which was structurally inefficient. The Soviet era, at least seemingly so, came to an end in December 1991, when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus signed the Belvizha Accords, dissolving the Soviet Union and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States. Belarus entered a transitional period under the provisional rule of the Supreme Council. Adopted in March 1994, the national constitution transferred the functions of the Prime Minister to the President of Belarus. This, as it later turned out, was a legislative shot in the knee, a catch-22 that a certain kolkhoz manager sought to exploit. In a two-round presidential election in June and July 1994, relatively unknown Alexander Lukashenko emerged victorious. Over the years, through the expansion of presidential powers, the removal of term limits and rigging consecutive elections, he made himself virtually unremovable. Throughout his rule, the dictator has mastered the art of balancing between the West and Russia. From 1994 to 2014, Lukashenko aligned Belarus closely with Russia through economic and political agreements, such as cheap Russian energy supplies and the Union State of Belarus and Russia, the latter of which technically merged the two states into a single entity. Lukashenko occasionally distanced himself from Moscow to gain concessions from Europe and the US, especially when Russia pressured Belarus on economic or political matters. Still, as a former military stronghold in the western periphery of the USSR, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic played an integral role in the Soviet Union's Western defense shield, a function that the Belarusian president has repeatedly aspired to recast as the defender of Russia's borders against a hostile West. This dictate returned especially sonorously post-2020, when yet another rigged presidential election extended Lukashenko's reign and pushed hundreds of thousands of Belarusians to take to the streets. Lukashenko's seventh presidential term and 3 years into Russia's full-scale war, the last European dictator's Soviet colours are as bright as ever. His country will host 13,000 Russian troops during the Zapad 2025 military exercise scheduled for September. The Union state lives on.
Before we discuss Alexander Lukashenko's 30-year rule, Belarusia, the nation, the territory was subject to horrific experiences in the Second World War especially. What effect did that have on the process that we talked about, the 19th century process of nation building a separate Belarus? Did it eradicate this professional, the educated classes, and so after the Second World War, when the dust died down, it was relatively easy to impose a Soviet model on the country, on the nation?
Well, for the first time in history, Belarus found itself within the borders that we have. What we call the Belarusian lands mostly were integrated, save for some parts, were integrated within one state after the Second World War. Well, there was surely the Belarus was part of the Soviet Union, but a distinctive part of the Soviet Union.
In what sense was it distinctive? What was the...
It means formally it was recognized as an autonomous republic, federative republic of the Soviet Union. What was even different from Ukraine, that Belarus was considered as one economic space. So it was, however, some decisions were taken in Minsk. Surely it was under the control of the Communist Party. There were also always the second secretaries of the Communist Party, of the Central Committee of the local Communist parties that were sent from Russia, responsible for ideology. And economically, Belarus became what we call assembly shop. Because there were investments in industry, for military reasons, of course, but
sure.
Investments, and Belarus was quickly, let's say, modernized and urbanized. We are no longer, from late 60s, I think, or 70s, we are no longer a peasants' nation. And there were some elements of the Belarusian national distinctiveness that were preserved by the Soviet regime, even if the whole policy was of Russification. We remember when Khrushchev was in Minsk in early 60s, he said that the sooner we switch to Russian, the quicker we would build communism. So, and Belarusians, they are distinct from Russian, but close. And the Orthodox Church was reimposed from Union Church was in after the 1831 uprising. The Union Church, which was to some extent national church, was forbidden in Russia. In Imperial Russia. So by the Orthodox Church, and we also remember, I go back a bit once again in 19th century, that the governor of the western provinces after the January uprising, after Kalinovsky uprising in our understanding, he said that what was not finished by Russian bayonets would be finished by Russian church and Russian school. And the Soviet Union continued this model. So there were no, let's say, high culture. Some some remnants, some elements. For example, there was the literature in Belarusian language. Well, in order to control...
So the Belarusian language was actually encouraged by the Soviet?
Not, it was accepted, to some extent allowed to be developed, but in narrow public spaces. Well, the Communist Party spoke mostly in Russian, while some literary figures could. And it was also the beginning of our renewal, national renewal, when with Glasnost, Gorbachev Glasnost, our famous writers started writing letters to Gorbachev saying, look, the Belarusian language is discriminated. This policy of Russification which continued, but still there was some background. And for example, they didn't, now we have in Belarus much less schools with the Belarusian language of instruction than it used to be under the Soviet Belarus. Well, there were no, of course, in larger cities, even in Soviet times, there were no schools. Well, the Belarusian language was just taught, but not was language of instruction. The same is true mostly in today's Belarus.
What's been the cultural policy of Alexander Lukashenko? Is it, you mentioned that he's not from the high culture, the elite educated culture. Does this mean he gravitates more to Russia, the big brother eastwards, and he's importing the same models that we've been seeing on the territory and on the nation since the 19th century, Russification?
Well, he's from the eastern part of Belarus. He was born there, and surely, well, there are closer links to Russia. But no, even this region, Eastern Belarus, had a different story. And we remember that even Mogilov, during the 17th century, they first invited Russians, and then they chased them, the whole Russian organism. And well, and he's from Mogilov region. And well, there was also the tradition of Magdeburg law that was going to well eastwards to Smolensk, So for him, being pro-Russian, apart from his, let's say, Soviet roots, meant also the strategy of political survival. He had such a discourse vis-a-vis Russia that nobody across the Soviet Union had. And he also, well, to some extent we are now proud Belarusians that the West is maybe being conquered by the same populists that we were conquered in 1994. He offered very simplistic solutions. Well, we would relaunch the production lines, all the factories would work, like the peace would return to Ukraine. So with no explanation.
Simple solutions to complex problems.
Yeah, but his selling point was to talk to Russians in mildest, most pleasant way. Well, and this is why he stopped the development of the Belarusian culture, well, the Belarusianization that was reopened with 1991 independence. So, and he already in the year following his election, he held a referendum on the reintroducing Russian as the official language. So we have two official languages, but Russian dominates. So he was selling the strategic importance of Belarus, but also the ideological affinity to Yeltsin, later to Putin, in order to remain in power.
A final question to you, a very brief question. Does this mean that the evolution of Belarusian culture is done by expatriates, of the educated expatriates, or is there a
maybe no, not necessarily. Well, he was Lukashenko. If you look at things positively, he was contributing to our nation building because he showed how we should not do, and people, and especially after 2020, many people switched to the Belarusian language, started using it. And especially in immigrant community, sure, there is, especially there is even in expectations that public figures, they use mostly Belarusian language.
Yes, it's becoming there.
Well, the Belarusian culture surely now is free to be developed and promoted outside Belarus. but still there is.
Yes.
There are people. Some of us left. We are happy enough to have avoided being in prison, but many stay. And they do whatever they can. Yesterday I watched a video. There was an anniversary gathering of a great Belarusian poet, Ryhor Baradulin, and people came and they were there. And some people continue to speak Belarusian, even if it is extremely politicized, and you can end up in prison for the fact that you speak, especially to policemen, in Belarusian language.
Yes. Dr. Łahviniec, thank you very much for coming on to the programme.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for today. Join us again, new time, a new day. That's Tuesdays, 9:35 p.m, 21:35. So join us then.